Today, we're going to dive into a really intense ancient account of a city that was pushed to its absolute breaking point. We're pulling this story straight from the biblical text of 2 Kings, chapter 6, and we're going to break down step by step how a whole society can just collapse.
But you know, this is more than just a history lesson. This story really forces us to wrestle with a tough question. What does desperation really cost? Not just in money, but in our morality, in our humanity itself. All right, to give you a taste of how bad things got, let's start with just one shocking detail from right in the middle of this crisis. In the besieged city of Samaria, a donkey's head, something that's literally garbage, was selling for 80 shekels of silver. How does it get to that point? Well, to understand that, we have to look at the weapon they were facing.
So, it all starts with the military situation. The city of Samaria isn't being battered down by catapults or anything like that. No, it's being strangled. We're talking about a slow, patient, and absolutely brutal kind of warfare that basically turns an entire city into an inescapable pressure cooker.
Okay, so let's set the scene. The year is around 850 BC. A king named Ben-Hadad II from Aram Damascus takes his entire army and surrounds Samaria, which was the capital of Israel. And his goal? It wasn't to smash the walls down. It was to cut the city off completely and just wait for it to eat itself from the inside out.
And you have to understand, this wasn't just a battle of swords. It was a war of psychology, of logistics. Siege warfare was terrifyingly effective because it turned a city's greatest strength, its thick walls, into a prison. The attacker's best weapon becomes time, while the city's worst enemy becomes the hunger gnawing away inside those very walls.
And that hunger, boy, it has immediate and devastating consequences. See, before a society collapses morally, it collapses economically. The basic laws of supply and demand get twisted into their most grotesque and extreme forms.
The text itself describes it with this chilling, almost deadpan precision. A great famine takes over, and this bizarre, desperate new economy is born. We get two price points: 80 pieces of silver for a donkey's head, and 5 for just a handful of dove's dung, which they might have used for anything from seasoning to fuel. It's insane.
Now, to really wrap your head around that, 80 shekels, that was somewhere around 4 to 5 months of wages for regular laborer back then. Can you imagine spending nearly half a year's salary on something you would normally throw in the trash? That is what hyperinflation driven by pure, raw desperation looks like.
But the economic nightmare is really just the beginning. The story is about to pivot from market prices to a personal account that is so harrowing it reveals the true moral cost of this whole thing. It all starts when a woman cries out to the king himself.
So picture this. The king of Israel is walking along the top of the city wall, the very symbol of his kingdom's security, when he's confronted by one of his own citizens. And her cry for help, it's a sign that every other system, every other safety net, has completely failed. And the king's response is just one of complete and utter helplessness. He basically says, look, if God isn't going to help you, what do you expect me to do? He points to the empty threshing floors, the empty wine presses, the places where food comes from are bare. There is nothing left. When the king asks her what's wrong, she tells him a story, an unimaginable story, a survival pact she made with another woman. The terms are the ultimate taboo, a sign that civilization itself has just been put on hold. She says, this woman told me, give me your son so we can eat him today, and tomorrow we'll eat my son. And then she tells the king that they actually went through with it, the first part of this horrifying bargain. So we boiled my son and we ate him. The horror isn't some abstract threat anymore. It has actually happened. This is the city of Samaria hitting rock bottom. But then comes the betrayal. When it was the next woman's turn to fulfill her side of the pact, she hid her son. So now this first woman is coming to the king, not begging for food, but demanding justice for a broken contract born from absolute horror.
It's just, when you lay it out like this, the cold logic of it is what's so terrifying. A 2-day pact, a stomach-churning act on day 1, followed by a betrayal on day 2. It just shows that even in the middle of these unspeakable acts, the last shred of social trust has completely disintegrated.
So how does a leader even respond to something like that? When you're faced with a problem that has no solution, a horror with no remedy, the king is just completely overwhelmed. And his reaction unfolds in 2 stages. First comes the grief, and then comes the rage.
His immediate response is deeply human. He tears his clothes, which was a very public, very traditional sign of profound grief and distress. He isn't just mourning for this one woman, he's mourning for his entire kingdom. He's feeling the weight of all of it.
But that grief, it quickly sours into something else. Because when leaders are powerless, when they're desperate, they often start looking for someone to blame. And the king's despair pivots, searching for a scapegoat for a crisis that's far beyond anyone's control. And he makes this sudden, shocking vow. He says, "May God deal with me if the head of Elisha remains on his shoulders today." All that rage, born from his own helplessness, finds a target. And it's not the enemy army outside the walls. It's the prophet of God living inside them. This just shows you the staggering disconnect. The real crisis is the military siege, the famine, the moral collapse. The king's brilliant solution? Kill the messenger of God. It's a classic case of misplaced blame, of a leader completely failing to even look at the root cause of the problem.
So let's just quickly recap the anatomy of this collapse. It starts with external pressure from the military siege. That causes internal decay, famine, economic chaos, and just moral horror. And finally, that leads to a catastrophic failure of leadership, where the king's despair turns into rage against a scapegoat. And that leaves us on a cliffhanger. This whole crisis now comes down to a confrontation between a powerless king and the prophet he wants to kill.
Which brings us right back to that question from the beginning. The story of Samaria shows us a society that has tried every human solution and has failed spectacularly. Its economy is broken, its social contract is shattered, and its leadership is completely lost. So when everything has fallen apart, where does a society turn next?